Imagine this. You wake up tomorrow morning and look in the mirror, but the person staring back at you is a complete stranger. Not physically, every feature is exactly as you remember, but something in their eyes, something in the way they hold themselves, feels utterly foreign. You realize, with a creeping sense of horror, that you've been living someone else's life for so long that you've forgotten what your own face actually looks like underneath all the masks you've worn. Carl Jung, one of the greatest psychological minds of all time, told you there is just one rule to follow in order to meet that true self, but warned you that you are probably too weak to follow it. Today, we will uncover what that rule is, why it's so difficult to obey, and how ignoring it might be the single greatest mistake you ever make. And here is my promise to you. The last insight I share will be the most powerful and the most dangerous, because once you hear it, you cannot pretend you don't know it anymore. Before we go deeper, make sure you subscribe, leave a like, share this with someone who needs it, and comment your thoughts along the way. What we are about to explore could completely change the way you see yourself, your relationships, and the world you live in. This isn't science fiction. This is the psychological reality that Carl Jung, one of history's most penetrating minds, believed afflicts nearly everyone walking the earth. He discovered something so disturbing about human nature that it would make most people recoil in terror. We are all living as imposters in our own lives, and we're too weak to stop. But here's where it gets truly unsettling. Jung didn't just identify this problem, he found a solution. A single rule that, if followed, would free you from this psychological prison forever. Yet he warned that most people would never have the courage to follow it. Not because they couldn't understand it, but because the very act of following it would require them to destroy everything they think they know about themselves. Think about the last time you acted in a way that felt completely authentic to who you are. Not the version of yourself that pleases your family, not the professional mask you wear at work, not the social persona you've crafted to be accepted, but the raw, unfiltered truth of your being. When was the last time you felt that? Can you even remember? This amnesia isn't accidental. It's the result of a psychological conspiracy so subtle and pervasive that it operates below the threshold of consciousness. Every day, from the moment you wake up, you participate in an elaborate performance designed to keep your authentic self buried so deep that even you forget it exists. You smile when you want to scream. You agree when every fiber of your being wants to rebel. You conform to expectations that were never yours to begin with. And the most terrifying part? You've become so skilled at this performance that you've convinced yourself it's real. Jung saw through this illusion with surgical precision. He understood that beneath the carefully constructed facade of every human being lies an authentic self, not the self shaped by society's demands, not the self molded by others' expectations, but the irreducible core of who you actually are. And he discovered that accessing this authentic self requires following one simple rule. But here's the paradox that will haunt you. The very simplicity of this rule is what makes it so impossibly difficult to follow. It demands something from you that feels like psychological suicide. It requires you to voluntarily dismantle the protective walls you've spent your entire life building. It asks you to face truths about yourself that you've spent decades running from. Most people, when they first encounter Jung's rule, experience a moment of recognition so profound it feels like remembering a dream. They sense, somewhere deep in their bones, that this is the key they've been searching for their entire lives. But then, as the full implications become clear, something inside them recoils. The price seems too high. The risk feels too great. The comfort of the familiar mask becomes irresistible once again. And so they remain trapped, living as strangers to themselves, wondering why life feels so empty, why success feels hollow, why even their most intimate relationships feel like performances rather than genuine connections. But what if Jung was right? What if there really is one rule that could set you free? What if the weakness he spoke of, the weakness that keeps us imprisoned in our own lives, isn't fixed? What if the very act of understanding this rule, truly understanding it, could give you the strength to finally break free? The question isn't whether you're strong enough to follow Jung's rule. The question is whether you're brave enough to discover what it would cost you and what it might give you in return. The psychological prison you're trapped in didn't appear overnight. It was constructed brick by brick, starting from the moment you drew your first breath. Jung understood something that most philosophers and psychologists of his time missed. The human psyche is not a single, unified entity. but a battlefield where multiple versions of yourself wage war for control. At the center of this conflict lies what Jung called the fundamental split of human existence. On one side stands your authentic self, the irreducible core of who you actually are, complete with all your raw desires, untamed impulses, and dangerous truths. On the other side stands what he termed the persona, the carefully crafted mask you wear to navigate social expectations and avoid rejection. This isn't merely a philosophical abstraction. Neuroscience has revealed that your brain literally rewires itself based on the patterns of behavior you repeat. Every time you suppress your authentic response to please others, you strengthen the neural pathways that prioritize external validation over internal truth. You become, quite literally, a different person at the neurological level. But here's where Jung's insight becomes truly disturbing. This process doesn't just change how you behave, it changes how you think, feel, and perceive reality itself. You begin to mistake the mask for your actual face. The persona becomes so convincing that even you forget it's a performance. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this same phenomenon when he wrote about the herd mentality that reduces individual humans to mere components in a social machine. Arthur Schopenhauer recognized it in his observation that most people live their entire lives without ever truly thinking an original thought. But Jung went deeper. He understood that this psychological fragmentation doesn't just limit your potential, it actively tortures you. Think about the last time you felt genuinely at peace with yourself. Not the temporary satisfaction of achieving a goal or receiving approval, but that deep, unshakable sense of being exactly who you're meant to be. For most people, such moments are so rare they feel almost mystical. Jung would tell you this isn't because authentic peace is impossible to achieve, it's because you've been trained to fear it. From childhood, you learned that certain parts of yourself were unacceptable. Your anger was bad. Your sadness was weakness. Your wild creativity was impractical. Your deep questions were inappropriate. So you buried these aspects of yourself so deep that you forgot they existed. But Jung discovered something terrifying. Buried doesn't mean dead. These rejected parts of yourself don't disappear. They form what he called the shadow, a hidden reservoir of everything you refuse to acknowledge about who you really are. And this shadow doesn't remain passive. It influences your choices, sabotages your relationships, and creates the very problems you spend your life trying to solve. The most insidious part of this psychological split is that society not only tolerates it, it requires it. Every institution you encounter, from family to school to workplace, operates on the assumption that you will suppress your authentic nature in service of collective stability. You're rewarded for conformity and punished for authenticity, creating a feedback loop that makes the persona stronger and the authentic self weaker with each passing year. Jean-Paul Sartre called this bad faith, the act of lying to yourself about your own freedom and responsibility. Viktor Frankl recognized it as the source of what he termed existential vacuum, the crushing sense of meaninglessness that plagues modern life. But Jung saw something even more troubling. Most people prefer this psychological prison to the terrifying freedom of authentic existence. Because here's the truth that will disturb you. Breaking free from this prison requires you to face not just who you really are, but who you've been pretending to be, and why you've been so desperate to maintain that pretense. The shadow you've created by rejecting parts of yourself doesn't remain hidden in some distant corner of your psyche. It operates like a psychological puppet master, pulling strings you don't even realize exist. Every inexplicable burst of anger, every self-sabotaging decision, every relationship that mysteriously falls apart. These aren't random occurrences. They're your shadow speaking. Consider this disturbing reality. The parts of yourself you've worked hardest to suppress are the very parts that control your life from behind the scenes. That fury you've never allowed yourself to feel, it leaks out as passive aggression, chronic resentment, or sudden explosive outbursts that shock everyone, including yourself. The creativity you buried because it seemed impractical, it manifests as a gnawing sense of emptiness, a feeling that you're wasting your life even when you achieve everything you thought you wanted. Jung discovered something that modern psychology has only recently begun to understand. Psychological repression doesn't eliminate unwanted aspects of personality, it makes them more powerful. When you refuse to consciously integrate parts of yourself, they operate unconsciously, which means they influence your behavior without your awareness or consent. This is why people repeat the same destructive patterns over and over, wondering why they can't seem to break free. The patterns aren't conscious choices, they're the shadow's attempts to express what you won't allow yourself to feel or acknowledge. Your unexpressed truth becomes a force of chaos in your life, sabotaging your happiness in ways you can't even see. But the consequences extend far beyond personal psychological turmoil. Jung warned that when entire societies suppress their collective shadow, the results are catastrophic. History's greatest horrors, genocides, wars, systemic oppression emerge when cultures project their denied darkness onto others rather than facing it within themselves. The person who insists they could never be cruel, Jung observed, is often the most dangerous of all. Look around you and notice how this plays out in everyday life. The most judgmental people are often struggling with the very qualities they condemn in others. The person who viciously attacks dishonesty may be living a life built on lies they refuse to see. The individual who rails against selfishness may be desperately suppressing their own unacknowledged needs and desires. This phenomenon, which Jung called projection, creates a world where everyone is fighting battles with external enemies who are actually reflections of their internal conflicts. You waste enormous amounts of energy battling problems out there that actually originate within your own rejected psyche. The cognitive cost is staggering. Research in cognitive psychology reveals that suppressing thoughts and emotions requires tremendous mental energy. You're essentially running multiple psychological programs simultaneously, the authentic response you're suppressing and the approved response you're performing. This constant internal conflict creates what psychologists now recognize as decision fatigue, leaving you depleted and unable to make clear choices about what actually matters. Even your physical body bears the burden of this psychological fragmentation. Unexpressed emotions don't simply disappear, they become trapped in your nervous system, manifesting as chronic tension, illness, and physical symptoms that seem to have no clear medical cause. Jung believed the psyche demands integration, and if you won't do it consciously, your body will force the issue through breakdown. Perhaps most tragically, this split from your authentic self creates a profound sense of isolation. You can't truly connect with others when you're not truly connected to yourself. Your relationships become performances rather than genuine encounters between real people. You may be surrounded by others, yet feel fundamentally alone because the person everyone knows isn't actually you. The urgency of this situation cannot be overstated. Every day you delay confronting this reality, the shadow grows stronger and the authentic self grows weaker. The mask becomes more convincing, but the cost becomes higher. Soon, you may find that even when you want to be authentic, you no longer remember how. But here's where Jung's true genius emerges. He didn't just diagnose the problem, he discovered that the very shadow you've been running from contains the key to your liberation. The rebellion against your psychological prison doesn't require you to become something new. It requires you to reclaim something you've always been but were taught to reject. Jung called this process individuation. Not the creation of a new self, but the integration of all the selves you already contain. And the first step is so counterintuitive, it feels like psychological heresy. You must stop trying to be good. Think about that. Your entire life, you've been trained to suppress the parts of yourself that seem unacceptable, focusing only on cultivating qualities that others approve of. But Jung realized that this approach creates the very fragmentation that tortures you. A person who claims to be purely good is like a painting with only light colors, flat, unrealistic, and strangely unsettling. The path to wholeness requires you to acknowledge that you contain multitudes. You are capable of cruelty and kindness, selfishness and generosity, wisdom and foolishness. The goal isn't to eliminate your capacity for darkness, it's to integrate it consciously so that it serves you rather than controlling you. This integration begins with what Jung called shadow work, the systematic process of recognizing and reclaiming the rejected parts of yourself. Start by paying attention to your emotional reactions to others. The qualities that trigger your strongest negative responses often point directly to aspects of yourself you refuse to acknowledge. The person who irritates you most intensely may be showing you a disowned part of your own psyche. But here's the revolutionary insight that changes everything. These rejected aspects aren't inherently destructive. Your anger, when consciously integrated, becomes righteous fury against injustice. Your selfishness becomes healthy self-advocacy. Your darkness becomes the depth that makes your light meaningful. What you've been calling your weaknesses may actually be your greatest strengths in disguise. Jung observed that individuals who successfully complete this integration process become what he termed individuated, fully realized human beings who can act from their authentic center rather than from programmed responses. These people possess an almost supernatural ability to navigate complex situations because they're not wasting energy maintaining false personas. They can access their full range of human capabilities as the situation demands. History provides us with powerful examples of individuated beings who changed the world precisely because they refused to conform to collective expectations. Gandhi integrated his capacity for both gentleness and fierce resistance. Einstein embraced both his brilliant rationality and his childlike wonder. Maya Angelou owned both her vulnerability and her strength. These individuals didn't achieve greatness by suppressing parts of themselves. They achieved it by becoming fully themselves. The rebellion Jung calls for isn't against the world. It's against the internal tyranny that forces you to live as a fragment of who you could be. It requires you to question every belief you hold about yourself and ask, is this actually true? Or is this what I was taught to believe? It demands that you examine every role you play and determine, am I choosing this or am I performing it out of habit and fear? This process is simultaneously the most natural thing in the world and the most difficult. Natural, because authenticity is your birthright. You were born whole and had to learn fragmentation. Difficult, because it requires you to face the terror of standing alone without the comfort of collective approval and declaring, this is who I am. The moment you begin this rebellion, you'll discover something that will shock you. The strength you need has been there all along, buried beneath layers of conditioning and fear. Now we arrive at the truth. I promised you the one that will haunt you because once you hear it, you can never unhear it. Jung's one rule, the rule he said you're too weak to follow, isn't what you think it is. It's not about becoming stronger or more disciplined or more enlightened. It's far more radical and terrifying than that. The rule is this: you must become willing to lose everything you think you are in order to discover everything you actually are. Let that sink in. Jung wasn't asking you to improve yourself or optimize your life or find better coping strategies. He was demanding that you commit psychological suicide, the complete death of the false self you've spent your entire life constructing. And here's why this feels impossible. Everything you call your life is built around maintaining that false self. Your career, chosen to support an identity that isn't real. Your relationships, formed with people who know only your persona, not your authentic self. Your goals, your habits, your daily routines, all designed to sustain a version of yourself that you created to survive in a world that demanded conformity rather than truth. When Jung said you're too weak to follow his rule, he wasn't insulting your character. He was acknowledging a psychological reality that would make anyone tremble. To become authentic, you may have to destroy the very life you've built. Not metaphorically, literally. This is why individuation isn't a self-help technique or a weekend workshop. It's an initiation that dismantles everything you thought you knew about yourself and forces you to rebuild from the ground up. Some relationships will end because they can only exist when you're wearing a mask. Some career paths will become impossible because they require you to betray your deepest values. Some dreams will shatter because they were never really yours to begin with. But here's the paradox that will change everything. What you lose in this process was never truly yours anyway. You've been clinging to a shadow, fighting desperately to maintain something that was keeping you imprisoned. The person you think you'll lose by becoming authentic isn't real. It's a carefully constructed lie you've been telling yourself and the world. Jung observed something that most people never realize. The false self doesn't just limit your potential, it actively prevents you from experiencing genuine happiness, love, or meaning. Every moment of joy you felt while wearing the mask has been muted, filtered through layers of pretense. Every connection you've made has been incomplete because the real you wasn't present. Every success you've achieved has felt hollow because it wasn't really you who achieved it. The most devastating realization of all is this: you've been suffering your entire life not because life is inherently painful, but because you've been living the wrong life. You've been trying to force yourself into a shape that was never meant for you, and then wondering why everything feels so difficult and empty. When you finally find the courage to let the false self die, something extraordinary happens. You don't become a different person, you become yourself for the first time. The authentic self that emerges isn't some idealized version of who you wish you were. It's who you've always been underneath all the conditioning, fear, and performance. And that person, the real you, is far more powerful, creative, and capable of genuine happiness than the false self ever was. Because authentic power doesn't come from conforming to external expectations. It comes from alignment between your inner truth and your outer expression. When you stop wasting energy maintaining a false identity, that energy becomes available for living. But Jung's final, most unsettling insight is this: once you become authentic, you can never fully belong anywhere again. Not to your old social groups, not to conventional society, not even to the spiritual communities that promise enlightenment. You become what he called an individual, literally. One who cannot be divided. You belong to yourself first, and everything else second. This loneliness isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. When you stop seeking belonging through conformity, you discover a deeper kind of connection. You can finally meet other authentic beings as yourself, without masks or pretense. But you must be willing to walk alone until you find them. The weakness Jung spoke of isn't physical or moral weakness. It's the weakness that comes from addiction to approval, to security, to the familiar prison of false identity. Breaking any addiction requires you to face withdrawal symptoms. And the withdrawal from inauthenticity feels like dying because, in a very real sense, part of you is dying. So here's the question that will determine the entire trajectory of your remaining years. Are you willing to let that false self die? Are you strong enough to lose everything you think you are for the chance to discover everything you actually are? Are you ready to follow Jung's rule, knowing it will cost you everything you've built your life around? Most people, when they truly understand what's being asked of them, will choose the familiar suffering of inauthenticity over the unknown territory of being real. They'll convince themselves that they're not ready, that the timing isn't right, that they need to prepare more first. But Jung would tell you that waiting is just another form of weakness. The authentic self doesn't need preparation, it needs permission. You have one life, one chance to discover who you really are beneath all the masks and performance. The world will tell you who to be, but only you can answer who you actually are. The rule is simple, but the choice is yours. Will you live as yourself, or will you die as someone else's idea of who you should be? The clock is ticking, and your authentic self is waiting.